There's a new Ravenloft book out for 5.5e, which is a great excuse to play around in one of my all-time favorite genres, horror. It actually took me a long time to realize that I love horror, because horror is this massive umbrella with a zillion completely different subgenres underneath it. I'm not into slashers, for example, and I'm really only into gothic horror for the costumes. But then I discovered folk horror. The Witch, The Wicker Man, Midsummer. Turns out I do love horror, I just needed to find the right kind. That's why it's kind of a shame that the only horror campaign most D&D players know is Curse of Strahd, because Ravenloft can do way more than just vampires and castles. The Domains of Dread are basically little self-contained horror worlds, and the book gives you a framework to build your own in whatever flavor of horror you want. So today we are starting with nothing but the words folk horror and a healthy fear of harvest festivals, and by the end of this video we're gonna have a fully realized Domain of Dread ready to run at the table. Let's jump in. So quick disclaimer before we get into this, Wizards gave me early access and a free copy of the new Ravenloft book, but they did not sponsor this video. I think it's also worth noting right up front that the vast majority of the information in this book is already in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. So if you already own this one, you should be able to follow along just as easily. The core idea behind Ravenloft is that it's made up of these little isolated nightmare realms called Domains of Dread. They're surrounded by the Mists, which keep both the citizens of that land and any stray adventurers from escaping once they've been pulled in. They're basically the perfect little sandboxes to set adventures or campaigns in. Each domain is built around a specific type of horror. Everyone knows Barovia for gothic horror, but there's also Harakir for dark fantasy, and Valakan for slasher horror, and Daemonliu for psychological horror, and tons more. Are you so impressed that I know how to pronounce all those? Don't be, there's a pronunciation guide. But these domains aren't just spooky settings to wander around in. Each one exists specifically to torture a villain called a Darklord by twisting their desires against them. So Barovia exists just to ruin Strahd's day. You're doing important work, Barovia. Keep it up. The Darklord is the reason each Domain of Dread came into existence in the first place. Their evil was so great, these mysterious forces called the Dark Powers decided to punish them. The Dark Powers are basically just an excuse for the DM to justify any decision they make. Why did you get pulled into the mists? Dark Powers. Why are such strange things happening? Dark Powers. Why does silvery barbs have no effect here? Dark Powers. Dark Lords have a lot of influence over their domain, but they're also trapped there. Like my cats. Yeah, they're basically kings within these walls, but at what cost? I, of course, went hunting for folk horror domains, and there's just one in the book, although it is an excellent one. It's called Tempest, and the whole thing revolves around a green hag named Lorinda, but whom the villagers know as a goddess called Mother. The people of Tempest are friendly and welcoming, and overall live super great lives. Except for the human sacrifice, I guess, if you're not into that kind of thing. The write-up for Tempest, and for each of the other domains, includes a ton of information for game masters. Locations, lore, adventures, and unique stat blocks for the villains. That last one is a new addition that wasn't in Van Richten's, actually. If you want to learn more about the domains included in the new book, my friend Pointy Hat has a whole video about that coming this Friday. I'm actually really glad mine is coming out first because I've seen what he's working on and I can't follow that. But as we know, different kinds of horror resonate with different people, and you know better than any of the game writers at Wizards what kinds of horror will be most effective at scaring the pants off your particular players. Which is why, in addition to all these fully fleshed out Domains of Dread, there are also instructions for creating your own. So let's go make a nice little village with absolutely no dark secrets whatsoever. Oh, but first, these dark powers compel me to tell you about today's sponsor. My dear, why all these tears?
I'm a game master, and I'm desperate for resources for my upcoming sessions.
That's a dream I can certainly make come true. Do you know Czepeku?
I know they have beautiful, varied battle maps, tokens, and scenes to make both in-person and online D&D more immersive, but I haven't been able to spring for a subscription.
Good news, Czepeku has new tiers.
I obviously have enough tiers, lady.
Not that kind of tiers, you nincompoop. The Essential tier, TIER, gives access to Czepeku's library of over 8,000 fantasy maps, or over 3,500 painted scenes, or over 900 token presets, all for just $15 a month.
A more affordable subscription tier, with the ability to upgrade to animated variations and VTT integrations in the future, it's all I could have wished for.
That's right, it's the maps everyone loves for a lower rate. You know, I've been looking for a D&D game.
I would never play with someone who called me a nincompoop.
Oh, come on. The first step of creating your own domain of dread is its Darklord. The domain only exists because of the Darklord and whatever terrible acts they've committed, so they are the foundation on which the whole thing is built. We already know that we're working within the genre of folk horror, but before we start my favorite activity of inventing scary nature ladies, let's take a second to talk about genre a little more, because this is pretty dang foundational to your domain, and the book spends a fair amount of time breaking down each major genre into helpful steps for you to work from. Folk horror is named because of its ties to folklore and folk religion. It often takes place in an isolated rural setting and typically focuses on outsiders coming into one of those communities and discovering the horrifying realities of their traditions. This genre loves nature motifs and ritual sacrifice. Girls, same. The book breaks the genre down into a few key principles, like isolation begets weirdness and perversion of community. See, this is why I love folk horror so much. Both of those sound like fun. It also has rolling tables for villains, adventures, settings, and monsters. So if we wanted to just randomly generate our domain right now, we could do it with just a few dice rolls. Maybe our villain is a shapeshifter that takes on the appearance of the last person it fed on, or a bloodthirsty forest guardian that resembles a deer with two heads. But we already had our fun with random tables in my last video, and Ravenloft has a randomization mechanic that's even more fun, the Tarokka. Very obviously inspired by the tarot, this deck first appeared in the original Ravenloft adventure in 1983. And just like tarot, each card has its own nuanced meaning that can be interpreted in tons of different ways, depending on the context, the reader, and the cumulative quantity of dramatic flickering candles and cloying incense in the room. The more respiratory distress, the more likely you are to be told you're about to meet a mysterious stranger who will change your life. A standard deck of cards can be mapped to the Tarokka if you don't want to buy this specific accessory, but I also think you could totally use a tarot deck instead if you want the vibes. The meanings attached to actual tarot cards are just as interesting and narratively inspiring as the Tarokka, maybe even more so. And even though people do use tarot in spiritual practices today, they were originally invented in the 15th century as a parlor game. So using them to generate D&D plot hooks is historically accurate, actually. Anyway, let's try it out. The book instructs us to remove the high deck for this and just use the suits. We are starting with Past Life, and our first card is the Elementalist. This is the 5 of stars, which gives us the question, what pushed the Darklord to continue committing heinous acts? Now, while the 5 of stars is called the Elementalist, its meaning isn't quite so literal. This doesn't necessarily mean that our Darklord is an elemental mage. The book tells us that this card represents the triumph of nature over civilization, natural disasters, and bountiful harvests. The first idea that popped into my head with this is a dryad who's trying to fend off a nearby civilization that's starting to encroach on her wood. I know, shocking. I'm inventing a lady covered in leaves. I have a type, sue me. The townsfolk cut down trees, and suddenly the river floods and carries away their lumber. They build sheep pens too close to the woods, and the wolves start dragging the animals off at night. Hunters disappear, fields of crops go rotten, paths through the trees change without warning. The more the villagers try to tame the wilderness, the more violently the wilderness pushes back. That's why I always carry a sword. For fighting trees. Let's call the town Fairweald, which sounds nice at first, right? Weald means woodland in Old English, which is why you have real life places like Southweald and Wealdstone, and fair means nice, right? But there's actually an Old Saxon meaning of the word fair that means danger or a hostile attack. So, yeah, pretty cool, right? All the cool kids love etymological tomfoolery. Anyway, if you, like me, look at vengeful nature spirits and think, well, she's got a point, don't worry, we're about to push her from sympathetic to sinister with this next prompt, the Dark Catalyst. This is what corrupted our Darklord. In our case, the Healer. This is the 3 of glyphs, so it's the answer to the question, what drove them toward bloodthirsty revenge? The Healer symbolizes healing, a contagious illness, disease, or curse, those who practice the healing arts. Okay, here's what I'm thinking. Originally, this dryad was fighting back against the villagers because they were encroaching on her forest. Fairly standard eco-terrorism stuff. But eventually, all the floods and famines made Fairweald vulnerable enough that disease started spreading through the village, and the only cure for that disease was in the bark of the trees. Despite all her work to keep the villagers out of her forest, they're more desperate than ever to get in there and strip the bark off of her precious trees in order to survive. She did all she could to keep them out, but still she has to watch the living things she holds most dear getting skinned alive around her. Really makes you think differently about your willow bark tea, doesn't it? You monster. It's really starting to feel like an us or them situation to our dryad friend. Overcome by her grief and anger, she decides that if she can't stop the villagers, she'll let the disease do it, and she burns the forest down. Only one tree survives the fire, her own, now alone in the middle of acres of crumbling black skeletons of trees blanketed in white ash. I know, very atmospheric. What can I say? I'm a pro. As for the village, unable to cure their sickness, they become infamous for disease. Nobody wants to come in, and anyone from Fairweald is unwelcome elsewhere. Nobody wants to welcome someone who might spread their sickness, which means we have successfully created that isolated folk horror community we were going for. Oh yeah. It's all coming together. We have one card left to draw, her Wicked Ambitions, an unattainable goal that drives the Darklord's actions and ensures that they come into conflict with the adventurers. Ours is the Shepherd. This is the 4 of glyphs, so our Dryad pursues ways to relieve themselves of loneliness. That's perfect, because she slaughtered all her fellow trees. Of course she's lonely. The Shepherd symbolizes those who protect others, one who bears a burden far too great to be shouldered alone. You know, like the burden of trying so hard to protect your community that you end up destroying your community. Whoops. Now, keep in mind, the villagers don't know that the Dryad caused all this misery in the first place. All they know is that her tree is the last one standing, the only thing capable of curing their illness, and that tree is protected by a powerful spirit. So they create this ritual. Once a year, they choose one of their own to make a pilgrimage into the burned forest and beg the spirit to heal them. The chosen one makes their way through the charred wasteland and sleeps beneath the boughs of the last tree, and they never come back. But not like the villagers believe, because the Dryad healed them and sent them off into the world to begin a new life. This is horror, guys. It's much worse than that. She heals them, sure, but once they're well, she opens up one of those burned trunks and seals the chosen villager inside it, hoping the life force of a healthy creature will somehow revive the dead tree. The villagers die buried alive in wood, and the Dryad spends her days wandering through the burnt forest, whispering to the corpses of people that she's trapped within the corpses of trees, watering the scorched earth and waiting for them to spring back to life. Meanwhile, the villagers are out here like, wow, thank goodness the yearly tree pilgrimage is going so well. We're gonna call the Dryad Serotina, which is part of the Latin name for black cherry. I picked it because not only can its bark be used to treat a cough, its leaves and fruit contain a compound that, in certain circumstances, can be converted into cyanide. See, this is why I love nature themes in horror. Nature is already scary. We're all just one misidentified mushroom away from disaster. So that's our Darklord, a lonely Dryad who went way too far trying to defend her forest from interlopers, and all inspired by these 3 cards. All the domains of dread in the book have an aligned Tarokka card and an opposed one that suggests the terrible truth of its Darklord. So in our case, I would say the aligned card is the healer, because that's how the villagers see the Dryad, a benevolent spirit capable of curing their sickness. But for the opposed card, I've chosen the traitor, because ultimately it was she herself who not only caused the disease the villagers looked to her to cure, but also destroyed the forest she was meant to defend. Now that we have our Darklord, we can create a domain of dread that imprisons and tortures her, and of course that makes a scary and exciting adventure setting. To do that, the book tells us we need to develop details, create adventures, and choose monsters. There are prompts to help us develop details, but I feel like our story has already given us some very juicy elements to explore: the sickness, the forest, and the ritual of the chosen villager. Let's say in the early stages of the disease, people develop a cough. As it progresses, they come down with a fever and chills and fatigue, and in the late stages, lesions develop all over their body. Very leprosy-coded. I think that'll contribute to the spooky atmosphere. Maybe we can call the disease cherry pox, because the lesions are bright red and circular, but also because cherry bark can cure it. If I were running a campaign in this domain of dread, I would for sure come up with mechanics for how players can catch cherry pox and progress through its stages. That's a great way to make the adventure feel urgent. Nothing keeps you focused on the main quest like medical necessity. As for the forest itself, I think the villagers would treat it as pretty off-limits. Not only is it an ill omen, but it's the Dryad's domain, and it's very important to them to stay in her good graces. If players want to go explore the burnt woods, they'll probably have to do it in secret. Once there, they might encounter the Dryad doing her rounds, attempting to cultivate her dead trees. And if they try to cut down a tree or otherwise investigate it more closely, there's a good chance they'll find a rotting corpse stuck in there. Nature's Cadbury cream egg. And of course, the centerpiece of the entire domain is the yearly ritual where one villager is chosen to be healed. Everybody wants to be selected. Families pray for it. People spend all year trying to prove themselves worthy. From the villager's perspective, the chosen one gets cured and then leaves this cursed village forever to go start a better life somewhere else. The day of the pilgrimage has become this huge yearly celebration. Music, dancing, feasts, handmade gifts for the chosen villager to take with them on their journey. And flower crowns, of course. You can't have folk horror without flower crowns. And all this doesn't just matter on the day of the ritual, it would shape the village's culture year-round. Maybe families hang dried cherry branches over the sickbeds of relatives because they're believed to carry Serotina's blessing. Maybe parents tell children that if they behave badly, they won't be chosen for healing when they inevitably get sick. Gentle parenting is out, prophetic parenting is in. To run this at the table, we would also need some functional basics for the town. What buildings are there, what significant NPCs? I imagine the town would be very shaped by the cherry pox, so communal gathering spaces like town halls or market squares would be abandoned, boarded up, or even turned into quarantine facilities. Maybe medical practitioners in town would have high status, or we could have an organization of faithful who are the only ones allowed in the burnt forest, the Ash Keepers or something, charged with protecting the last tree. Cultists that adventurers have to dodge when they investigate the charred ruins. Speaking of adventurers, now that we have all of this laid out, we can imagine what kinds of actual encounters and plot arcs can happen in this space we've created. Let's imagine your players are pulled through the mists and end up on a pleasant little getaway to the plague-ridden town of Fairweald. At low levels, the players arrive a week or so before the yearly pilgrimage and start noticing all the weird things about this place that don't add up. No chosen one has ever been seen again after the ritual. Someone swears they saw a face in the bark of a burned tree at the edge of town. A sick child begs the party to help their older sister get chosen for the ritual because she deserves to live more than I do. You know, just some cozy small town roleplay. By the time players hit level 3-ish, they're undoubtedly exploring the burnt woods themselves. Maybe they're attacked by creatures that report back to Seratina. Maybe they find remnants of the gifts given to the chosen ones of years past. Maybe they even find a corpse in a tree trunk and realize this ritual is not even remotely what the villagers think it is. At which point the villagers also become a problem because they will not tolerate the adventurers risking their chance to be healed. So somebody's dead in a tree, big deal. They probably weren't worthy to be healed. But I'm built different. By mid-levels, Seratina is probably actively targeting the party. They're causing trouble, so they need to go. She sends them horrifying dreams of being choked by smoke in the middle of a wildfire. She does her very, very best to get them infected. Maybe she even sends the villagers a sign, trying to get the newcomers chosen for the pilgrimage. And of course, the final confrontation has to be on the day of the ritual. Whether the adventurers are chosen to be healed or they make their own way to the last tree, they have a chance to end the cycle once and for all. You can have rich descriptions of the ritual day celebration, the massive feast, the feelings of hope and desperation in the smiling, pox-riddled villagers, the vote to choose which person most deserves to be healed and to escape this awful place. Imagine the collective held breath of hundreds of people waiting to hear which one of them will be saved. And however they get there, imagine the party confronting Seratina as she emerges from her tree to lay her healing, bark-clad hands on the lucky villager, granting them their dearest wish mere moments before she ends their life in screaming, claustrophobic imprisonment, watching calmly with a hopeful smile on her face. I don't know about you, but I think that sounds like a pretty exciting final arc. As for monsters, obviously Seratina is the ultimate one. This is no CR1 dryad. She needs her own stat block that reflects her corruption and the twisted powers her domain has granted her. But along the way, the Guardian of the Forest has plenty of defenders to fight for her. I think any plant monster is pretty fair game for this campaign. Blights, assassin vines, shambling mounds. Any creature that would normally live in a forest can become an ash-dusted version of itself, thin from hunger and obeying Seratina's commands. We can also use those shiny new cultist stat blocks for high-ranking villagers once they realize the adventurers might get in their way. If you really want to go hard, maybe the Dryad's loving care has brought some life back into those corpse-stuffed trees after all, and brought the chosen back as undead horrors. The nice thing about Domains of Dread is that once you have a strong emotional core for the setting, all of these choices emerge naturally from it. We started with 3 Tarokka cards in a genre, and now we have diseases and rituals and natural disasters and corrupted dryads. That's a campaign, baby! So that's Fairweald, our cursed little folk horror nightmare, and all thanks to one dryad making some extremely bad decisions. If this domain sounded fun to you, you would probably really enjoy my adventure, The Corruption of ALDER GLEN, because in retrospect, it is accidentally very Domain of Dread coded. Much like the setting we just built, it's a folk horror adventure with spooky trees and isolated townsfolk who have an extremely weird relationship to the forest. For years, I've been creating stories that operate in contained spaces, because not only is it way easier to world build, it often results in a clearer theme. It's a sandbox that can be clearly defined so your players are free to wander around and stumble organically on every grotesque detail. ALDER GLEN is exactly that kind of setting, far from the nearest settlements, surrounded by a choking forest whose shadows conceal a whole lot worse than 1d4 wolves. You can get ALDER GLEN in print, as a PDF, or for Foundry VTT, and I'll put the links to all of that in the description. It remains one of my favorite things I've ever made, and it brings me so much joy every time I hear about you guys running it and scaring your players. That's what it's all for. If you want to try creating your own Domain of Dread, all the rules and guidance that I use today can be found either in the new Ravenloft: The Horrors Within or in Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. I hope this inspired you to go make your own weird little horror setting. And remember, if you visit a rural village and find them setting up for a harvest festival, just don't risk it, man.